The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic temps of panic. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan shimmered, indifferent to the giants falling within its glass towers. Julian, the CEO, stood trembling, his hands pressing into the mahogany table as he stared at the inevitable ruin of his empire. But the door didn't open for a savior in a tailored suit. It creaked open for the man who had cleaned their toilets for 20 years. Daniel Kovacs walked in, his blue janitor's jumpsuit stained with bleach, carrying a weathered leather briefcase. He didn't look at the panic. He looked at the chair at the head of the table. "You've made a mess of my company, Julian," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that silenced the room. "And I think it's time I finally finished the cleaning." The city of New York never truly sleeps, but at 2:17 a.m., it breathes in a different rhythm. For Daniel Kovacs, this was the hour of ghosts. The elevator of the Sterling Kovacs Plaza ascended in a smooth, sterile silence, the digital floor numbers flickering like a countdown. Daniel watched his reflection in the polished brass of the doors. He saw a man whose face was a roadmap of whispered sorrows and weathered resilience. His eyes, a piercing, icy blue, remained sharp despite the heavy bags of exhaustion that sat beneath them. To the world, he was just Daniel, an invisible man who erased the footprints of the powerful. He stepped out onto the 50th floor, the soles of his worn work boots making no sound on the expanse of marble. The scent of the building at night was always the same, a mixture of lemon-scented floor wax, stale air conditioning, and the faint, lingering aroma of ambition. He dipped his mop into the gray water, the sound of the wringer echoing through the empty corridor like a rhythmic heartbeat. Every stroke of the mop was a meditation. He wasn't just cleaning floors. He was reclaiming the space, inch by painful inch. 40 years ago, this very floor had been a construction site of dreams. Daniel could still remember the smell of raw concrete and the blueprint paper that felt like silk between his fingers. He had been the visionary, the immigrant who saw gold where others saw rubble. Beside him had stood Arthur and Marcus, men he called brothers. They had shared coffee from rusted thermoses and promised that their names would one day touch the clouds. But ambition is a corrosive element. When the first billion-dollar contract was signed, the brotherhood dissolved into a calculated execution. They didn't kill him. They did something worse. They erased him. Through a series of forged signatures and predatory legal maneuvers, Daniel was stripped of his shares, his intellectual property, and his identity. He was cast out into the biting chill of a November night with nothing but $30 and the clothes on his back. He watched from the gutters as the building rose. His name, Kovacs, eventually stripped from the signage, replaced by the sterile corporate branding of Sterling Holdings. For decades, he lived in the shadows, working menial jobs, fading into the gray tapestry of the working class. But Daniel Kovacs was a man of inexorable patience. He knew that the higher a tower climbs on a foundation of lies, the more spectacular its eventual collapse will be. As he mopped the executive wing, he passed the office of the current CEO, Julian Sterling, the grandson of the man who had first betrayed him. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the soft glow of a computer monitor illuminated a desk cluttered with high-end whiskey and crumpled documents. Daniel said, the hum of the city outside providing a low-frequency hum to his thoughts. He looked at the shadows on the wall, feeling the weight of the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silency kind that precedes a landslide. For the past 15 years, Daniel had lived a double life that would have baffled the executives who stepped over his bucket. Every cent he earned, every meager dollar from his janitorial shifts and his small pension had been channeled into an intricate web of offshore accounts and anonymous shell companies. He lived in a basement apartment in Queens, eating canned soup by the light of a single bulb, while his digital avatar, an entity known only as the Sentinel, slowly began swallowing the distressed debt of Sterling Holdings. He had watched Julian's rise with a mixture of pity and calculated interest. Julian was a man of glass shining, transparent, and incredibly fragile. He had inherited a throne he didn't understand, spending the company's reserves on vanity projects and high-stakes market gambles. Daniel saw the fractures forming years ago. He saw the reckless leverage, the hidden losses, and the decay of the company's moral core. While Julian was attending galas in the Hamptons, Daniel was in his basement, studying the company's quarterly reports with the precision of a surgeon. He wasn't looking for revenge. He was looking for the exact moment of structural failure. The mop moved back and forth, a rhythmic pendulum of destiny. Daniel reached the end of the hallway, where a massive portrait of the founding partners hung. Arthur Sterling looked down with a smirk of arrogance preserved in oil. Daniel stared into the painted eyes of his betrayer. He felt no anger, only a profound, cold clarity. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted key fob. Every night for a year, he had used his master key to enter the server room, not to steal, but to observe. He knew the company was hemorrhaging cash. He knew the bankruptcy filing was being drafted in secret. And he knew that when the collapse happened, thousands of middle-class employees, people with mortgages and children and dreams would be crushed under the weight of Julian's incompetence. The weight of the secret felt like lead in his chest. He was the janitor, the man who saw everything and was seen by no one. He saw the panicked late-night phone calls Julian made to his lawyers. He saw the shredded evidence of embezzlement. He saw the soul of the company rotting away. Daniel squeezed the handle of his mop, his knuckles turning white. The time for observation was ending. The market would open in 6 hours, and the rumors of Sterling Holdings' insolvency would hit the news cycle like a hurricane. He turned the corner toward the service elevator, but stopped when he heard a muffled sob coming from the break room. He pushed the door open slowly. There sat Sarah, a young intern who often stayed late to finish the work the senior partners ignored. She was staring at a termination notice, her eyes red and swollen. To her, this was the end of the world. To Daniel, it was a reminder of why he had endured the humiliation of the last 40 years. The night is always darkest just before the light returns. Sarah, Daniel said softly, his voice cutting through her grief. She looked up, startled, wiping her eyes. It's over, Daniel. The company is gone. They're saying we won't even get our final paychecks. How can they just do this? Daniel looked at her with a gaze that seemed to hold the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. He reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out a pristine, white handkerchief, handing it to her. They think they own the walls, he whispered, but they've forgotten who built the foundation. He left her there, confused and shivering, as he stepped into the elevator. He didn't press the button for the lobby. Instead, he pulled a gold key from a hidden chain around his neck, a key he had kept for 4 decades. He inserted it into a restricted slot on the elevator panel. The light turned a deep, blood red. As the elevator began to descend into the private high-security archives in the sub-basement, Daniel felt his heart rate begin to climb. This was the point of no return. The documents he needed, the original, unamended partnership agreements that proved his legal claim to the land itself, were awaiting in a vault that had not been opened since 1984. The elevator doors hissed open to a dark, dust-covered floor. Daniel stepped out, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. He walked toward the vault, but as he reached for the handle, the building's silent alarm system suddenly began to pulse with a low, rhythmic red glow. He wasn't alone. From the shadows of the archive, a voice rang out, cold, sharp, and dangerously familiar. "I wondered when the ghost would finally come home," the voice said. Daniel froze. The silhouette of a man stepped into the light, holding a silenced pistol. It was Julian's head of security, a man who knew far more than a janitor ever should. The silence in the sub-basement was absolute, save for the rhythmic, hollow dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors. Victor, the head of security, stepped into the pool of flickering amber light, his eyes narrow and predatory. He didn't look like a man surprised to find a janitor in a high-security vault. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a reason to pull a trigger. Daniel stood perfectly still, the flashlight in his hand casting a long, trembling shadow against the steel walls. He could feel the coldness of the concrete floor seeping through his boots, a familiar chill that reminded him of the many winters he had spent in the shadows of this very building. "I've watched you on the monitors for 3 years, Daniel," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the stale air. "The way you touch the walls, the way you linger in the executive offices. You aren't just a man with a mop. You're a ghost looking for a way back into the world of the living. But ghosts don't belong in the basement of a billion-dollar empire. They belong in the ground." Daniel did not flinch. He looked at the barrel of a silenced pistol, then up at Victor's face. He saw the lineage of betrayal in the man's features. Victor was the son of Marcus, one of the 2 men who had signed Daniel's life away 4 decades ago. The cycle of arrogance had been passed down like a family heirloom. "Your father always did prefer the direct approach," Victor Daniel said, his voice devoid of fear, carrying a weight of authority that seemed to physically push back against the darkness. "But he was never very good at reading the fine print. I suspect you've inherited that particular blindness." Victor's grip tightened on the weapon, his knuckle turning a ghostly white. The tension in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. But before Victor could speak, Daniel reached slowly into the pocket of his bleach-stained jumpsuit. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a single, laminated photograph. He slid it across the dusty floor toward Victor's feet. It was a picture of Victor's father, Marcus, standing next to a young Daniel Kovacs on the day the foundation of this building was poured. They were both smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders, oblivious to the decades of resentment that would follow. "I gave your father his first job," Daniel whispered, the words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. "I paid for your education, Victor. Those checks your mother received every month after Marcus passed away, they didn't come from the company's pension fund. They came from me, from the ghosts you've been watching on your screens." The security chief's eyes flickered with a momentary, visceral confusion. The predatory certainty in his posture wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Daniel turned his back on the gun and faced the vault. He didn't need a code. He didn't need a crowbar. He reached for the heavy iron wheel and turned it with a precision that suggested he had practiced the motion in his dreams every night for 40 years. The mechanism groaned, a sound of grinding metal and shifting gears that echoed like a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the earth. The heavy door swung open, releasing a gust of air that smelled of ancient paper, ozone, and the preserved scent of 1984. Inside, the vault was a cathedral of forgotten history. While the world above transitioned to digital clouds and ethereal data, the truth of Sterling Holdings remained bound in leather and ink. Daniel walked to the center of the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He bypassed the gold bars and the emergency cash reserves. He went straight to a small, unassuming wooden box tucked away in the furthest corner. He opened the lid. Inside lay the original, unamended partnership agreements. These documents were the soul of the company, signed in a time when a handshake meant something more than a legal formality. They contained a clause that Julian and his legal team had spent years trying to locate and founder S reversion. It was a legal failsafe Daniel had inserted when the company was still just a dream in a garage. A clause stating that, in the event of gross mismanagement or imminent insolvency, the entire land lease and the building itself would revert to the original architect. As Daniel's fingers brushed the cool vellum of the contracts, he felt a surge of electricity, a visceral connection to the man he used to be. The janitor was gone. In his place stood the architect, the visionary, the man who had been broken but never defeated. He tucked the documents into his weathered briefcase, the leather creaking under the weight of his redemption. He turned back to Victor, who was still standing by the door, the pistol lowered to his side. The security had looked at Daniel not as an intruder, but as a force of nature he could no longer contain. "The sun is rising," Victor Daniel said, walking past him toward the elevator. "And with it, the era of the Sterling family ends. You have a choice. You can stay in this basement and guard a tomb, or you can come upstairs and watch the truth finally find its voice." The elevator ride back to the 50th floor felt like an ascent into the heavens. As the floors ticked by 10, 20, 30, the city of New York began to bathe in the golden, bruised light of a frantic morning. When the doors opened, the executive wing was in a state of absolute, unmitigated chaos. Assistants were weeping into their phones. Paperwork was being fed into shredders with a desperate, mechanical hunger. In the center of the storm was the boardroom. Through the glass walls, Daniel could see the board of directors, their faces pale and gaunt. Julian was at the head of the table, his silk tie loosened, his expensive shirt damp with the sweat of a man who had run out of lies. On the table lay the liquidation papers. With one signature, the company would be dismantled, the assets sold for scrap, and 10,000 employees would be cast into the cold without a second thought. Julian picked up the pen, his hand trembling. The lawyers hovered like vultures, their pens ready to finalize the death of a legacy. Daniel stepped toward the door, his blue jumpsuit a jarring contrast to the sea of charcoal suits. He didn't knock. He didn't ask for permission. He pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, the sound of the impact silencing the room instantly. Every head turned. Julian looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a venomous irritation. "Get out of here, Daniel," he screamed, his voice cracking with the strain of his collapse. "Can't you see we're in the middle of something? Clean it up later. Just get out." Daniel didn't move. He walked slowly toward the table, the heavy briefcase swinging at his side. He looked at each board member, his gaze so piercing and steady that they found themselves looking away, unable to meet the eyes of the man they had ignored for 20 years. He reached the head of the table and stood directly across from Julian. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Daniel said, his voice calm, echoing with a terrifying clarity. "There is a mess in this room, but I'm not here to mop the floors today. I'm here to take back my chair." He opened a briefcase and slammed the original contracts onto the mahogany table, right on top of the liquidation papers. The sound was like a gavel striking in a courtroom of the gods. Julian reached for the documents, his face contorting in confusion, but as his eyes hit the first page, the color drained from his skin until he was as white as the marble floors Daniel had polished every night. "This is impossible," Julian whispered, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. This can't be real." "Who are you?" "I am the man who built the walls you've been hiding behind," he said. "And as of 5 minutes ago, Julian, you're trespassing." Just as Daniel prepared to deliver the final blow that would seal the company's fate, the heavy doors of the boardroom burst open again. A group of federal agents in dark windbreakers flooded the room, their expressions grim. But they didn't go for Julian. They walked straight toward Daniel, their badges gleaming in the morning light. The silence that followed the arrival of the federal agents was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, pressurized quiet that exists in the eye of a hurricane. The lead investigator, a woman with eyes as sharp as flint and a stride that brooked no argument, walked directly to the head of the table. She didn't look at Julian, who was currently hyperventilating into his silk sleeve. She looked at Daniel. She looked at the man in the bleach-stained blue jumpsuit and nodded with a profound, professional respect. "Mr. Kovacs," she said, her voice cutting through the stagnation of the room. "The encrypted files you provided to the Bureau over the last 18 months have been fully verified. The grand jury has returned indictments for securities fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. We have the warrants." The boardroom erupted into a low, frantic murmur. The directors, men and women who had spent years ignoring the man who emptied their wastebaskets, were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves from the collapsing sun that was Julian Sterling. Julian's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. He looked at Daniel, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. The janitor hadn't just been cleaning the floors. He had been a silent, detail predator dismantling Julian's empire bit by bit from the darkness of the server rooms. Daniel had used his invisibility as a weapon, a cloak of shadows that allowed him to see every illicit wire transfer and every forged signature without ever being suspected. You destroyed us," Julian finally whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "You worked for us for 20 years. And you destroyed us." Daniel leaned forward, his hands resting on the polished mahogany table, the same wood he had polished to a mirror shine just 6 hours prior. "I didn't destroy you, Julian," Daniel replied, his voice a low, melodic rumble of ancient truth. "Gravity destroyed you. You built a tower of greed and expected the laws of physics to ignore you. I simply provided the documentation that the Foundation had already rotted away. I didn't come here for revenge. Revenge is a petty emotion for small men. I came here for stewardship." As the agents moved in to escort Julian and his inner circle from the building, the news of the coup began to ripple through the skyscraper. In the hallways, employees stood at their desks, watching in stunned silence, as their fearless leader was led away in silver handcuffs. Daniel stood at the window, watching the sunrise fully claim the Manhattan skyline. The amber light caught the dust motes in the air, making them look like floating flecks of gold. He felt a strange, hollow lightness in his chest. The weight he had carried for 40 years, the weight of being a ghost in his own house, was finally lifting. He turned back to the remaining board members, who were now looking at him with a mixture of terror and opportunistic hope. They expected him to sit in the chair. They expected him to fire them all and install his own regime. But Daniel had learned a secret during his 4 decades in the shadows. The most powerful man in the room is the one who needs nothing from it. He picked up his weathered briefcase, the one containing the original 1984 deeds, and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" one of the directors stammered. "The company is in free fall. The markets open in 20 minutes. Without a leader, we lose everything." Daniel stopped at the threshold. He thought of Sarah, the intern, who had been weeping in the break room. He thought of the thousands of families whose livelihoods were currently hanging by a thread because of the arrogance of a few men in suits. "I have already signed the reversion of the land lease to a charitable trust," Daniel said, his voice echoing with an absolute, undeniable authority. "The building and the company's remaining assets are being restructured into an employee-owned cooperative. You are all relieved of your duties. I've already appointed a temporary management team, people who actually know how to build things, not just sell them." He walked out of the boardroom and down the hall, passing the cleaning cart he had left near the elevators. He paused for a moment, his hand lingering on the handle of the mop. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for that simple tool. It had been his camouflage, his teacher, and his constant companion during the long, cold nights of his exile. It had taught him that there is no labor too small for dignity, and no man too high to be brought low by his own reflection. Daniel stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. When the doors opened, the Grand Marble Hall was filled with hundreds of employees. They had heard. They knew. The silence was absolute as the janitor walked across the floor he had spent half a lifetime cleaning. But as he reached the center of the lobby, a single person began to clap. It was Sarah. Then another joined, and another, until the sound of applause was a thundering roar that shook the very glass of the Sterling Kovacs Plaza. Daniel didn't stop to take a bow. He didn't offer a speech. He simply nodded, a small, knowing smile touching his lips, and walked out of the revolving doors into the crisp morning air of New York City. He crossed the street and sat on a park bench, watching the building glow in the full light of day. For the first time in 40 years, his name didn't need to be on the signage. It was written in the hearts of the people inside. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple, tarnished coin, the last thing he had owned when he was cast out for decades. Aguand flipped it into the air. He caught it, stood up, and began to walk. The janitor was gone. The architect had finished his final masterpiece. The moral of this story is that true power is never found in a title, a corner office, or a billion-dollar valuation. True power is found in the quiet strength of the human spirit, to endure the unthinkable, to maintain integrity in the face of betrayal, and to understand that the loudest voices in the room are rarely the ones that hold the truth. Resilience is the currency that never devalues, and justice, while it may move with the agonizing slowness of a glacier, is as inexorable as the tide.